Hello, so today's talk is Heart Attacks Prevent Chocolate, and when I distributed the poster for this talk, the discerning members of our community already understand that I'm going to talk about correlations. Okay, so as the resident statistician in our department, I'm often asked to talk about critical appraisal. And at first I thought that can't be too hard, but as I researched more deeply into the arena of critical appraisal for this talk, I realized that it isn't as easy as all that to do a good critical appraisal of the scientific or medical literature, because there are some errors which are so prolific in the scientific literature that most of us will accept them, even though we might know that they are wrong. But critically appraising the medical literature is essential. I've talked about this in previous talks because there are literally thousands of medical journals out there. Elsevier alone publishes 2,500 journals. And 75 clinical trials, actual clinical trials, are published every single day. And this is new data from 2021. 11 systematic reviews are published every single day. So even if we only read systematic reviews in our own fields, we might be having to read one every single week. And for people who are in general practice, they might have to read one every single day. So how are we ever going to find the needle of relevance in a haystack of studies? How do we know which ones make sense and which ones don't make any sense at all? So in this talk, I'm going to go over some of the most commonly seen errors in medical papers, which are so commonly seen that we miss them. So first up, let's go to the title of this talk. So when I first submitted the title of this talk to the talk organizers, Dr. Bill Chan, they came back with a query. They said, "Is this actually a wrong title? Did you mix up the writing? Did you mix up the words?" I wrote back, "No, I didn't mix up the words because I actually want to talk about the quite recent news articles which talk about chocolate consumption preventing heart attacks." Okay, so I want to talk about this journal which was published in this paper which was published in the journal Heart in June a few years ago. So nowadays, it's not only scientists who read about medical research, because so many scientific studies published nowadays are accompanied with a press release. So this particular study on chocolate was accompanied by a press conference touting the benefits of eating chocolate. And if the newspapers are to be believed, we can all eat as much chocolate as we like because it's good for us. But before we take these newspaper headlines as gospel, let's go to the original study and see where these headlines come from. So the data for this study comes from a long-running epidemiological study known as the Norfolk study. This originally aimed to look at cancer risk. I think several hundred publications have come about from this data alone. The Norfolk study is a really famous study done in the UK. So here is Norfolk, is a town in eastern England where 96.5% of the population are Caucasian. This is compared to about 60% Caucasians in London. So this study began recruiting participants in 1993, and they completed recruiting in around 1997. So around 30,000 people who lived in the town of Norfolk were identified from a general practitioner's registers. And they were asked to complete a food frequency questionnaire. They were also asked to complete questions about their exercise frequency, and they were asked twice during the survey period, and these two periods were 8 months apart from each other. Then the participants were followed up for up to 20 years for health-related events. So the food frequency questionnaire asks people the amount of each listed food they ate in the past year. And it's actually very cultural specific. So the questionnaire might ask, how often do you usually eat burgers? Or how often do you usually eat a baked potato for dinner? So the list of foods they gave the participants is about 8 pages long, and it contained around 200 foods and drinks. Now, I'm not sure about you guys, but I have trouble remembering what I ate last week, let alone how often I ate this and that in the past year. If I had filled in the food questionnaire a couple of weeks ago, I would have reported eating this stuff, because it was Chinese New Year in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago. So these are the popular foods that I might have reported eating a lot of if I had filled in the questionnaire a couple of weeks ago. And if I have been asked to fill in the questionnaire at the end of December, I may have this stuff at the forefront of my mind. I might have been drinking champagne, eating mince pies and turkey, etc., because a couple of months ago it was Christmas, and this is the usual Christmas stuff that I would eat. It doesn't mean I habitually eat this stuff. So what did the epic Norfolk study find to warrant all the headlines? Okay, I'm going to have to wake you guys up from your lunch hours. Sorry about this. There's some actual data here now. So out of 20,000 people who were followed up from the original 30,000 people, so around 3,000 of these people suffered a cardiovascular event. When the participants were equally distributed into 5 groups, this was the average daily amount of chocolate consumed. Okay, so here, these are the people who ate no chocolate or reported eating no chocolate a day. These people here reported eating between 15.6 and 98.8 grams of chocolate per day. So 98.8 is like 3 bars of chocolate per day. So this is how many people reported eating from here, 15.6 to 98.8. So actually this is a very, very varied group. Okay, and this is the number of people who this is the number of people in each group who suffered a cardiovascular event. So if I put this in percentages, it seems as though only 12% of the people in this group who ate the most chocolate suffered a cardiovascular event in the follow-up time. They were followed up for up to 20 years. And 17% of this group who reported eating no chocolate were actually had suffered a cardiovascular event. So this is the basis of all those newspaper reports, including the BBC and the Daily Telegraph and all the big British newspapers, who said chocolate consumption reduces heart attacks. This is where the data comes from. This is where the headlines come from. I'm going to leave you to judge this for yourself. The investigators also noted that those who consumed the least amount of chocolate, they were older at recruitment. They also had a higher BMI. They had a higher waist-hip ratio. They had a higher rate of type 2 diabetes. They had higher systolic blood pressure and higher plasma C-reactive protein. So this is what was noted at baseline. The people who consumed least chocolate had this whole bunch of other things, which, as clinicians, you know these are actually risk factors for cardiovascular events. So after looking at this list of things which characterize the people who consumed the least chocolate, or the opposite, that characterize the people who consumed the most chocolate, I'm inclined to conclude that it's actually the risk of cardiovascular disease which prevents the participants from eating chocolate. So people who already have diabetes may be less inclined to eat more chocolate. Those who are fatter, those with a higher BMI, higher waist-hip ratio, those who are older, they are more likely to eat less chocolate. So does chocolate consumption prevent cardiovascular events? Or are people with risk factors for cardiovascular events less likely to consume chocolate. So the first take-home message, this. I know you must have heard it 1,000 times before, because this has become such a cliche. Correlation does not infer causation. Just because it appears that those who ate more chocolate had fewer heart attacks, it could very well be the other way round. It could be that those who knew that they were at higher risk of heart attacks just ate less chocolate. And when looking at this data here, it seems quite clear to me that it's heart attacks which prevents chocolate. We have to remember that no matter how correlated something appears to be, if there is no reasonable rationale to why they might be correlated, then the correlation might just be spurious. And some very helpful people have illustrated this concept quite nicely. So data from the US Department of Agriculture and National Vital Statistics show that the divorce rate in Maine is correlated to consumption of margarine, with the Spearman's or the Pearson's R value being 0.99. Now we should all remember that an R value of 1 means perfect correlation. So somebody has plotted these graphs to show us why should divorce rate and margarine consumption be correlated, but they are. The number of maths doctorates awarded is correlated to the amount of uranium stored at US nuclear power plants. Again, this R value is 0.95. Okay, very, very well correlated, but there should be no reason why these two things are. The consumption of mozzarella cheese is correlated to the number of civil engineering doctorates awarded. I can't remember what the R value is, but you can see that those lines are very, very closely drawn on that graph. So, before the chocolate lovers amongst us despair, it's not that I'm saying that consumption of chocolate is definitely not beneficial to the heart, but there have been animal studies showing that increased intake of theobromine, which is the primary alkaloid found in chocolate, is beneficial. All I'm saying is beware of correlational data. It might not really be saying what the investigators and chocolate lovers hope they are saying. Okay, so the next study I will talk about is the ISIS study. This was actually published in The Lancet in 1988. This is a really old study, but it just shows so well about the way investigators cut up and slice up data. So I've dug this trial out, although it's an old trial. This was a randomized trial on the use of intravenous streptokinase, oral aspirin, both or neither, on treatment for suspected acute myocardial infarction. This was a European-wide trial and involved over 17,000 patients in 417 hospitals. And it found that both streptokinase and aspirin significantly reduced mortality at 5 weeks. So for those patients given both streptokinase and aspirin, the result was better than either agent given alone. When the investigators submitted this data to The Lancet, the editors there thought, well, this is a large study, involved 17,000 people. They asked the investigators to do a subgroup analysis to make sure that streptokinase and aspirin works on everybody. So the investigators divided the patients into 12 subgroups, and indeed, they found that in 2 of the subgroups, neither aspirin nor streptokinase seemed to have an effect on decreased mortality risk. So, this is what the investigators did. They divided all the patients into 12 subcategories. They found that streptokinase and aspirin worked well on preventing future cardiovascular events in 10 of the groups, but 2 of the groups there was no effect seen. I'd like to see in the chat what subgroups you think the investigators divided the patients into. Can I have any suggestions in the chat? No? No ideas? There's 12 groups. Is everybody awake? What about my students? Geographic areas, 12 subgroups. The emphasis is on the number 12, not age, not by age, not by geographic areas. The emphasis is on the subgroup number 12, 12 subgroups. No ideas. Month of birth, thank you. Thank you. Months of the year, months. It's worse than that. Star signs. Okay. So, Vivian got that one. So, basically, the investigators had recorded all the patients' birthdays, and they were able to separate them into groups according to their star signs. And it appears that those who were born under Gemini or Libra do not respond to aspirin and streptokinase. And everyone, with the exception of the astrologers, okay, everyone laughed, when they saw how the investigators had constructed the subgroups, because they knew that star sign you were born under could not possibly dictate your response to drugs. And that the investigators of this study, they deliberately performed this particular subgroup analysis to illustrate the dangers of subgroup analysis. They wanted to show everyone it's not worth randomly dividing, even by age or geographic area, because there are dangers to this type of subgroup analysis. But how would you react if you were reading a study and the subgroups were not so blatantly silly? And if they illustrated a pet theory of yours, how would you react? You would think that the data were real. Okay, so this is another randomized control trial. This was published ages ago in 1978 in the New England Journal of Medicine. It involved around 600 patients, which found that aspirin reduced risk of stroke in a high-risk population, but only the men. So subgroup analyses showed no benefit in giving women aspirin. Because categorizing patients according to gender, according to their sex, seemed to be a legitimate division. Women at high risk of stroke were deprived of aspirin therapy due to this paper, until systematic reviews published around 20 years later refuted the non-effect of aspirin on women. So let's recap. It's easy to find evidence of correlation between two things, but it's not easy to find evidence that one thing actually causes the other. Only when changes in one variable cause another variable to change can we say there's a causal relationship. We have to remember that correlation is not the same as causation, because sometimes two things can share a relationship without one causing the other. And even if there is a causal relationship between the variables, you have to consider the direction of the relationship. For example, there might be a correlation between people's moods and their physical health. But which variable influences the other? Do good moods improve physical health, or does good physical health improve people's moods? Some types of research can give us evidence of causal relationships, while other types of research can only help us find correlations. For example, randomized controlled trials can provide us with good evidence of causal relationships, but cross-sectional studies and surveys, they cannot. It is important to remember the difference between correlation and causation. So we've got to be aware of subgroup analysis. They may sound legitimate, but if the trial only recruited a few more patients than their original power calculation dictated, then making smaller subgroups would definitely leave the study underpowered. And power calculations, we've talked about this in previous talks. Even subgroup analyses on seemingly large trials could be read with a pinch of salt. Remember that if you torture the data for long enough, it will confess. And if the subgroup analysis seems like data dredging to you, it probably is. And remember that authors are not obliged to report on every single subgroup analysis that they perform. It may only be that the positive results are presented in the paper. So I want to thank you for listening and welcome any questions in the chat box.